Hi, everybody. Welcome aboard. We are the Fantasy Formula, and we're live ahead of the Miami Grand Prix. Rob is on location in Miami. Rob, are you enjoying the sunshine so far?
Yes, Adam, it's good to be down in Miami. I haven't actually had much of the sunshine because I wasn't out.
And so as you'll find out throughout the course of the hour, Rob is working on his limited connection in the hotel and his hotspot. So you'll have at least me the whole time, probably Terry the whole time, but maybe not Rob. So I'll be with you the whole time, and I want to fire it up soon once the chat gets warm. All right, perhaps we can either grab Terry or move into the results of the sprint qualifying. There's Terry. Hi, Terry. Welcome aboard.
Thank you. I'm not on location like Rob. I'm still in my shed, luckily.
That's good. That's good. You and I are in the usual spot, so I'm feeling pretty good about this.
Yeah, we're okay. We've paid our broadband bill.
Good. Good. Terry, I want to talk right away about sprint qualifying because there were some interesting results. Notably, McLaren, they fitted all these upgrades to the car and they immediately shot to the top of the grid. It's unlikely, I thought, that these upgrades would make an impact so soon. What did you see from sprint qualifying?
To be honest, they really struggled with the soft tires, obviously getting them in the window. Lots and lots of updates. When you listen to what Zach Brown said, it was pretty much easy to name what wasn't new on that McLaren, to be honest. Certainly in terms of Lando's car. Like we said, there's 50% of the updates have applied to Oscar's car, so he's got half of them. They haven't said which half it actually is yet, which is quite interesting. But I think the thing you got to remember is they might not be able to get the performance straight away from that McLaren because with so many new parts, they're going to be running different setups, trying different things. And that's probably why we saw Oscar just go that little bit faster than what Lando did, which some commentators were alluding to because he's still got some of the old parts on and it's probably easier to get it in the zone. So we might see McLaren drop off for the sprint in terms of Lando's car, but then come back with a much stronger race pace tomorrow with those changes to part firmware that you're allowed to make, almost using the sprint like a test, like a mini test with some data and some setup changes. That's probably the danger with Lando this weekend.
And that's a great segue into our contest question this week. For anyone who hasn't entered yet, head on over to our FanAmp base and let us know how many McLaren drivers you think will finish in the top 5 among all fantasy scorers this week. And this is going to be such a relevant topic throughout the show. We have McLaren upgrades, we have limitless users, we have teams with regular budgets that are considering moving into McLaren assets. So I think that's going to be a lot of our questions heading into this week. Rob, I see you're back. Do you have any initial thoughts on McLaren and what you saw from sprint qualifying?
No, sorry about that. I hope this doesn't persist throughout the show, but I think you and Terry covered it very adequately, so I'm happy to jump straight in.
Good. While we get going on the rest of the show, I did promise I'd bring my bottle of Almave to the show, so I'm going to pour one out, and let's see over the course of the show how this goes for me. Cinco de Mayo's tomorrow. I wanted to celebrate live with all of you. All right. Perhaps we can bring up the timings from sprint qualifying. I don't know if we can fit all three of us and the screen share. Well, we can. Wonderful. So the other surprise this weekend was Daniel Ricciardo P4. This is his highest qualifying performance in any format of qualifying since Mexico last year, and that was his best race of the year. Do we think something is magical with Danny in a pseudo home race here in the US?
I'll start. I think it's obviously a great sign that he's been able to deliver a good result in the sprint qualifying after very much struggling through the first 5 races of the season. And I thought he was on for a real shot at a half decent result last week until obviously Stroll ruined his race. So. Fascinatingly, the last time he started P4 was in Mexico last year, and he ended up ending the weekend in P7 after that Grand Prix. I know it's a sprint qualifying result, but notwithstanding that, I wouldn't take anything away from his performance. And Yuki was obviously out in Q2 as we saw. So fingers crossed he's on for a top 8 finish in the sprint. It'd be a great result for him, I think.
And correct me if I'm wrong, he's still carrying that 3-place grid penalty from China, right?
Yeah, for the actual Grand Prix itself, yeah.
Yeah. I was about to ask that, Terry. So, I mean, hopefully he can score a few points for us today and sprint qualifying. And then, as you say, Terry, if he's starting a few spots back in the Grand Prix, has the upside for overtake, because I think the race pace of that car looks a lot better than it has in recent times.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, they have actually some slight tweaks to the floor on the V-carb as well. So there is a small update to the V-carb, and Daniel certainly looks a lot more happier since that new chassis come into play from China. We know that obviously he was running well until then, and he is a confidence driver. He's a driver who relies on feeling at home with the car, as he's proven all over his career. So I think the fact that this qualifying result will just do him the world of good, and hopefully if he can turn that into a good result in the sprint itself, then actually going into tomorrow, yes, he's got that grid penalty, but I'm still expecting him to be near the top of that midfield pack. Even probably, yeah, the way the Mercedes is shown at the moment, I think they might even be challenging the Mercedes pace, judging on their performance so far this weekend. So it's a really good weekend and a good opportunity for Daniel to get some points, get some confidence going, and maybe just sort of put to bed some of those replacement rumors that are flying around about him.
Yeah, Terry, I'm wearing my Lewis fifth gear Garm shirt, but you have to scroll down a bit to get to my boys in 11 and 12 behind a Haas and both Aston Martins. It's definitely tough sledding for Mercedes right now. And I want to go over to, I don't have it up right now. There's an ideal qualifying pace that Lawrence Barretto posted this morning. And it basically had Mercedes P6 or so among the constructors. So it basically says what we saw in sprint qualifying wasn't a fluke, and Mercedes are taking a step back this weekend.
Yeah, I think for me personally, I know we've got the luxury of Limitless to choose from all of the best drivers going around, Adam, while you enjoy that Almave. But I definitely think before the weekend, Lewis was after his sprint quali performance last week. I maybe had an inkling that he could be a roughy fifth pick in my Limitless lineup this week, but I think that's more or less concerned after sprint quali that this week that there's probably better options to go around outside of the two Red Bull drivers, Leclerc and Norris.
All right. I want to hit off the chat a little bit. Got a lot of folks that have joined us nice and early. Good morning, Mike. SKD55 Garage says, evening from Australia. Oh, my goodness. Thanks for joining us, SKD.
Wow.
Elise is joining us from Latvia. Hello, Elise. Just a couple of drinks says, let's go from Amsterdam. Oh, yeah, it's definitely proper drinking hour in Amsterdam right now.
Looks like Dave is trying to hook Robert with some tickets. You might want to look at that one, Rob.
Oh, yeah. Dave, to answer your question, I will be jumping around a bit more tomorrow. I think I'm going to be in the Paddock Club today, if I'm not mistaken. So if by all means, hit me up on Twitter if you want to connect. I'm obviously more than happy tomorrow if people are at the track to meet up with them at any point. So feel free to reach out on Twitter if you'd like to connect.
Great point. Derpy Cake says, I want to use Limitless, but I don't know if I should pick Ferrari or McLaren, and then follows up by saying, with 3x DRS on Max, I don't know who to 2x. So I'll cover off the second question first. I don't recommend the 3x DRS boost this week for exactly what you said, Derpy Cake. You have to afford a good 3x driver, a good 2x driver, and then not sacrifice the constructors. And we just don't have the budget for it this early in the season. So I recommend holstering that 3x boost until later in the year. Our budgets are going to grow, and I think you'll be able to spread that love a little bit more. I think last year we were able to 3x Max and then 2x either Alonso or Norris as the season went on. So I definitely see better options ahead. Now, Rob, let me ask you about the first question. For Limitless, as your second constructor, did McLaren show you enough to edge out Ferrari, or are you holding pattern with Ferrari?
That's, I think, the question that a lot of us were maybe entertaining before the sprint qualifying results yesterday. And then you've now seen, I mean, maybe we can bring this up on screen in a bit, but the F1 Fantasy Tools points projections have McLaren as the second highest scoring constructor, which is quite fascinating given it was an underwhelming sprint quali result. But I think, and Terry, you might get onto this a little later. I know we were talking about it on the show before, but obviously the tire compounds and that McLaren just looked a lot better on that medium, which will probably be the pick of the bunch. If last year's strategies are anything to go by, where a lot of people started off the line in the Grand Prix on mediums. So I think come the race, they probably will look more appetizing as an option, assuming they're able to deliver a slightly better performance in Grand Prix qualifying later this afternoon.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in terms of the tyre compounds, you've obviously got the medium and hard tyres are probably going to be the race tyres. So the fact that we're seeing them drop off after just one lap, when flying like the soft tyres themselves, I don't think a lot of teams are going to be using them at all come race day on Sunday. So I think that the fact they look so strong on the medium compound is probably a really good positive for McLaren fans to have a look at. I don't think the softs are going to get much of a run out at all, not even in the sprint itself. They look like they were degrading far too quick to be a reliable tyre for anything bar someone going for a fastest lap towards the end. So definitely a medium and hard strategy I can see tomorrow. Most likely going to be a one stop as well around Miami, 20-second pit stop there. So yeah, it's plenty of tyres for them to choose from, but I'm fully expecting that medium hard strategy to be the way forward for all of the teams, to be honest.
Yeah. And so this is the F1 Fantasy Tools listing for the constructors. You can see they have McLaren up at the top, but the difference between McLaren and Ferrari in the latest rider sims is only 11 points or so, and that's the difference between a fastest pit stop for Ferrari, a couple of overtakes. I think the margin of error, if you pick the wrong one in this case, is very small for Limitless. So I'm not losing too much sleep over if McLaren slightly edge out Ferrari in this case. And then if we move up to the top here, for the drivers, you can see there's pretty high confidence in Norris's ability for overtakes in the sprint, and that Oscar Piastri's performance in the sprint qualifying wasn't a fluke, that he would be right behind what is currently shaping up to be the 5 drivers I'm considering for Limitless.
It sounds like you're very much leaning towards a triple Red Bull, triple Ferrari, and Lando Norris lineup at this stage.
That's true. That's right. Yeah, I've already selected the Limitless. So what I posted on Twitter last night is indeed locked and loaded, definitely using Limitless. And then unless anything comes out in the next 45 minutes or so that really changes my mind, I think this is my top 5. And then for constructors, I am holding station with Ferrari.
Yeah, my only caveat to that, which Vitch has put in the chat as well, is Oscar Piastri. He seems to be struggling with his tyre management in the race itself this season. It seems to be one of his big sort of struggles in terms of getting on top of that compared to what Lando does. So I would probably say that Sainz and Leclerc in a race pace might just edge out Oscar in terms of overall race pace, even if the McLaren might be faster on paper. There's something around Oscar and struggling with keeping the tyres in the optimum sort of working condition, and following when you look at the strategies with Lando, he seems to go off a bit in the race. So that's probably the only downside I'd say with running the McLaren strategy for this weekend.
I think it's a really, really good point, Terry, because we've seen only sprint qualifying and the single lap pace with all these upgrades. You only saw one FP1 session where you're trying to dial in a lot between the session and the sprint qualifying. So it's hard to tell, will these upgrades extrapolate into really great race pace? And Lando gave us enough to feel good about it in China, whereas Oscar, I think, hasn't totally earned my trust yet. He was one of our losers coming out of China for last week. All right, just saying hi to some more folks in the chat. Georges is coming to us from Lebanon. Good afternoon to you. Mexis is coming from Marbella, Spain. Or Marbella. I'm probably going to pronounce half of this wrong. I'm so sorry. Brian Clark is coming to us from Canada. Good morning to you, Brian. All right. And then Dusan asks, how many points of a penalty justifies using Wildcard in a weekend like this? And I think, Rob, let me know if you disagree. I think 20 is right around the magic point. 30 is automatic. 10 is probably not enough. 20 falls right on that fence of you could take it and I wouldn't fight you too much on it. But if you use the wild card, that would be fine too.
Yeah, you're right on the money there. I think it's a -10. I mean, I took a -10 last week in China to get Max into my team, and that worked out swimmingly. So I think, and we also saw a number of people move in that same direction in Japan on a non-sprint weekend. So I think it's justifiable that you can get away with that -10 without going for wildcard. I think also the -30 is probably at that point worthwhile using the wild card. -20, it is, like you say, kind of a bit of a tough one. I would still be inclined to use it because -20 is, can be the difference between, particularly if you end up on the wrong budget drivers or drivers at DNF, enough to really make the case that it was just the unfortunate decision. So I think for me, if I ever got to a point where I'm taking a -20, which could happen after Limitless, if I decide to change my lineup in Imola with those upgrades, it's very possible that I will activate the wild card. So I think -20 is probably the sweet spot for me.
I like it. let's head over to some lineup reviews. We have a bunch lined up. This first one is from Mastivos, and you can see there are a few lineup options on the screen here. The current team has Sainz and Alonso, so that's a good deal there. And then with 2 Haas, that's a very big budget builder that Mastivos has here. And the 2 options to change are into a Verstappen build and then just different flavors of backmarker. My first thought on this is it does make sense to change into a max build on a sprint weekend just because he's so huge here. He's won both races in Miami, neither of which from pole. Last year, he came back from P9 to win the race with fastest lap and driver of the day. So I think there's just going to be a ton of points that come out of your 2X driver. And then it's just a matter of which flavor of backmarker you want to support that team. Rob, do you have any thoughts on the remaining 4 drivers?
I mean, I alluded to this earlier in the week. I'm 100% aligned on having Max in teams on a sprint weekend just because he does have that additional upside for points, which you will ultimately multiply with the 2X on him. I think in terms of the rest of the team, I think if you have the budget to get to at least one Haas driver over a Williams or a Sauber, then I think that would be my preference just because of not only the race pace, but that overall consistency you're expecting from K-Mag or Nico Hülkenberg. I'm just bringing up the lineups on my other screen because it's too small to view it on my phone while we're streaming. But in terms of the two on the right-hand side, both of which I really like, it's, correct me if I'm wrong, but a toss-up between Albon and Tsunoda versus Sargent and Ricciardo. I think initially, without looking at the points projections or anything like that, any team, and I know this is very unfair on Logan, but any team without Logan or any combination without Logan Sargent, I'm immediately gravitating towards just because I think there is not that consistency that we have kind of wanted or expected from someone at that budget driver position. So I think I favor Albon and Tsunoda. I think Tsunoda and Ricciardo are pretty evenly matched, but then Albon and Sargent is a foregone conclusion for who's the better driver there and the more consistent of the two. So I think Mastivos, I'm leaning towards that team in the middle.
Me too. And on the one hand, Logan Sargent has finished 9 straight Grand Prix, but there have also been a lot of signs that he's flirting with disaster. He had that incident in Japan where he went off the track into the gravel where he almost lost it. He's had some earlier sessions where he's written off a car before. So it's not that Logan's been totally clean. It's just good timing on when he's taken vacations off the track. So I would go with the safer team in the middle there. And hopefully we can get a good result from Alex today. Also, I think Alex was demoted to P20. Yes. So he's starting last from the sprint. So a bit more of an opportunity for Alex to gain positions than someone like a Ricciardo who will likely drop a bit.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but was that the first time Logan's outqualified Alex in his career?
It was.
So interesting there.
That's a shocker.
Bottas gone to the back with his grid penalty, if I remember rightly.
Oh, true.
Because Bottas got one for blocking, didn't he? So
let's fix this. Let's go to the sprint grid. Terry's right again.
There you go.
The brain's trust.
I didn't doubt you for a second. Luckily, this middle lineup has them both. You've got P19 and P20 heading into the sprint. So I think all the more reason for that middle lineup. Terry, actually, let me...
Like struggling. Sorry,
I wanted to ask you. Oh, sorry, you go ahead.
Doesn't he? I was just saying that Valtteri looks like he's struggling this weekend, though, doesn't he? With the changes Sauber made and just performance off the Sauber this weekend.
That's exactly what I wanted to ask you. So there were these changes at Sauber, and most notably, Valtteri has a new race engineer. And while he was trundling around the lap, he clearly impeded Oscar Piastri, who was coming through almost a really nasty collision that Oscar handled with a lot of grace. That's the race engineer's job, and you could tell Valtteri restrained himself a little bit in his radio message that he needs more out of that engineer. What do you think the impact is, Terry, of that change, and could that impact Valtteri's race weekend?
I think it's huge because if you listen to Valtteri in the press conference, it's certainly not an agreed move that was done with Valtteri's blessing. He was very political when he was speaking about it on Media Day, when he said that it was a move that's been made and all the questions around it should be directed towards the team in terms of the change. So it's clearly not one that Valtteri's asked for. It's clearly not one that he's happy about. And we all know how important that race engineer driver relationship is, and they've not even had any chance to work on it, talk about it. It's already shown there's problems in qualifying. So I think that Valtteri certainly isn't feeling the love at Sauber, and I don't think the car's performance this weekend puts him in a good place in terms of, you know, delivering a performance which might just change some people into maybe looking at Alpines, looking at Joe ahead of Valtteri. There's some options in there which maybe this weekend might just be worth playing if you're not using those limitless chip, your budget building, and bring some drivers on board.
Very interesting.
It's fascinating. Sorry, I'll just quickly say it's funny that, you know, we've talked about that dreaded wheel nut for Sauber the last few weeks, and as soon as it looks like they're on the other side of that, Valtteri gets a new engineer. So it's almost from one kind of complication into another. He just doesn't seem to have much luck as not just an F1 driver, but as an F1 fantasy asset too.
All well said. Let's move on now to Sim on the Pace, and Sim on the Pace has a few options here. Let's look. So there's a double Sauber option in the middle, double Williams option on the outside, and then a Gasly Sargent option first. And I think the thought is that they would want to move back to a budget building team for Imola. So I like all three of these options to start. And Max can tie Seb with 31 race wins from pole position if he takes pole and wins the race this weekend. So another potentially milestone weekend for Max. I'm down to either option 1 or option 2. I've kind of liked what I've seen out of Alpine these last 2 races. We have Ocon that got the floor. Terry, did Gasly get the floor this week?
He has. He's running with it. Yeah, he ran with it yesterday for the first time. So they're both on the new updated chassis and floors. They've saved quite a bit of weight. Apparently, that's where the actual savings from the first time they've hit the minimum sort of weight all season. So they're definitely moving a step in the right direction.
Well, that's such a relief to hear. And I think and his teammate Esteban Ocon, highest qualifying of the season for Alpine, last time out in China, P13, tied that with a P13 qualifying for the sprint this weekend. So I think Alpine are starting to take the corner. So I see a lot of upside there. Perhaps Gasly has higher race finishing upside than Albon, but because Albon's finishing starting this sprint P19, you might have more overtakes there. Rob, what do you think? Which of these backmarker drivers has the most overtake opportunity, but also the best race finishing opportunity?
Look, I am kind of inclined to agree with you, Adam. I think Alpine has certainly made a couple of strides forward in the last couple of races. I'm not suddenly suggesting they're going to score a bucket load of points this weekend, but I wouldn't be surprised if Ocon or Gasly are on for a point or two across both racing sessions. So I would be half tempted by Gasly, and I think I haven't really alluded to them on Twitter or much at all on our race week preview show either, although I know you are still remaining optimistic as much as possible. But I think between the three, I'd probably take an Alpine over a Sauber or a Williams driver, because I think it's Gasly versus Zhou versus Albon, if my eyes are
basically
serving me correctly. So yeah, look, I think I don't mind Gasly as a punt there. I think he's on for a good result at some point, and I'm a big Pierre Gasly fan, so fingers crossed for a good result for him this weekend. I think he also was your pick to, even though it didn't come off, FanAmp pick of the week, which Alpine driver would out qualify the other in SQ yesterday.
Every now and then I get my Alpine takes right. I'm holding out hope for them this season. All right, let's move on to Tash NZ75. All right, so here's a team here with driver heavy, and Ferrari and Haas as the constructors. I recommend for this team that you divest from Max and try to get that Red Bull constructor in. And a common theme throughout this year we've been harping on is building from the constructors up, because these constructors get bonuses for putting both drivers into Q3 and for all the work that they do with the fastest pit stops. Red Bull, we recommend them for this spot because they've gotten the 1, 2, and 3 fastest pit stops in the last 2 Grand Prix, and back-to-back 100-point races, which Rob had mentioned in his preview video earlier this week, is unprecedented in the game. So I think, as much as I think Max is going to dominate at this track, I would accept his points and all of the bonus benefits of the constructor in your replacing Haas spot.
I think fully aligned. If you can get to Red Bull in maybe even 3 moves, which it looks like Tash has on the screen here. I think it could certainly work going from Haas F1 team, maybe Leclerc and Ocon if you can. If not, maybe entertain a wild card or even a -10. But I agree with you, Adam. Red Bull should be a priority transfer for this week if they can.
We've got about 30 minutes left until the contest drawing, so make sure you answer in our FanAmp base which McLaren driver or how many McLaren drivers you think will finish in the top 5 of fantasy scoring this week. Great race milestone coming up for Lando Norris. He's going to tie Lewis Hamilton for most race starts with McLaren this weekend. So as young as he is, it feels like we've had him for a while.
Could be on for another record of most races on the podium without a win, but I won't speak that into existence for too much longer.
Don't go there, Rob.
All right, let's move on to our friend D Bergeron, who quite often sends lineups into us. So I appreciate you coming back. This is a team with Max, double Williams, double Sauber, Red Bull, Ferrari. And I think we get this question a lot of, I can afford the Max build, but it comes at the cost of double Williams, double Sauber. My take on this is I'm totally fine running a team like this. I think Max and the 2 constructors by themselves will do enough for you to have a good result this week. I wouldn't argue with you if you stayed with a cost cap building team just to try to get a slightly better lineup going into Imola. But I think on a sprint weekend, I'm leaning slightly toward the build you see here.
Yeah, I like it. And David, I think if not that, I'll be able to catch you up at the Miami track before the deadline, but always happy to talk fantasy if we are fortunate enough to cross paths this weekend.
Yeah, if there's a good final fix opportunity, make sure you tackle Rob in the paddock or wherever you see him and make sure he gives you a good answer.
Turn 15.
Yeah.
Fantastic. All right. Now we have a lineup from Jeremy. And let's see. This looks like Ricciardo and Albon versus Gasly and Hülkenberg. Or maybe there's a few.
Ricciardo Sargent versus Gasly Hülkenberg. Oh, no, sorry, you're right. You were right the first time. Ricciardo Albon, Gasly Hülkenberg.
Ooh. I'm leaning toward the second team, but I got to tell you, it's 51-49 for me on team 2. You've got the basics of Max and the 2 constructors. Then you're looking at 2 of the back markers with Sargent and Bottas, hopefully moving up the grid as things move on. Team 1 has Albon at the bottom and Ricciardo at the top for the sprint. So I think Albon will move up, Ricciardo will move down, and that will be net neutral, as Gasly, I think, will hang out around where he's qualified. So that's why I'm leaning a little bit more toward team 2, because I don't quite know what to make of Ricciardo with how far he could drop in the sprint, or could he contend for points? Do you have any thoughts, Rob?
Yeah, I was looking across at the F1 Fantasy Tools points projections for these 2, because like you, Adam, I'm finding it hard to split both of those lineup decisions, which makes me think when it gets to this kind of point with any team, I like to just employ a go with your gut kind of approach, because it is kind of splitting hairs. The most interesting thing for me, just looking at F1 Fantasy Tools on the other screen, is that Ricciardo is the driver projected to score the lowest amount of points this weekend with 0.3 points, which I think is perhaps a little conservative of an estimate. And I'm not criticizing the F1 Fantasy Tools guys, because they do a sensational work at pulling together data and simulations for this. But I think Ricciardo projected to score 0.3 points starting from P4 on a sprint weekend, where he should pick up at least a few points if he can finish inside the top 10 fantasy wise. Makes me think that it's probably a lot closer than we give it credit for. I'd say it's maybe only because he's coming off back-to-back DNFs that his simulation is as low as it looks.
I have to imagine they're assuming that Ricciardo falls pretty far from P4, maybe into the midfield. So be -7, -8 or so in the sprint, and then is just middling in the Grand Prix and finds himself maybe 1 or 2 points in the Grand Prix. And that nets out to be a score close to 0.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, on this one, sorry, I would just go on team 2. I think Gasly's got a point to prove with an updated car, and he's chomping at the bit to get some results. I think Daniel will kind of get swallowed up in the sprint and go backwards before he settles towards the bottom end of the points. I also think that Nico Hülkenberg, obviously buoyed with that new contract, is going to be able to prove a point as well. And the Haas actually isn't, too bad around here. It's quite sort of good in terms of the midfield. So if if I had to go between the two and the scores are saying, I'll probably go team 2 for me, just on the gut basis of Gasly and Hulkenberg. I think it's going to outperform what team 1's going to do.
Love it.
It's such a great turnaround for Hulkenberg. This time last year, if I saw him qualifying in the top 10, I would say get out of that as quickly as you can, because he's going to plummet down the grid because of that tire management. But Haas have done such a great job of reviving their tire strategy this year that I'm actually confident of Hulkenberg and Magnussen when they qualify up around the top 10, that they can hold those positions throughout the sprint and Grand Prix. Okay, jumping back into the chat, because I think we've got a bunch of questions backing up there. Kev asks, are we all jumping on the Limitless bandwagon this week due to China's success? I know Rob and I are, and I think part of it is that we had always planned to use our Limitless chip early in the season because the running order is somewhat certain. We're looking for tracks with a bit of stability. Miami had no DNS last year. The Ferraris and Red Bulls tend to have a really solid track record here. And also later in the season, our budgets are going to grow so that Limitless doesn't have as big a gap to a normal team and the benefit's not as big. So I think we've always planned on it being around this time of the year. There's no guarantee, like Kev says in the chat, that it'll work twice in a row. But I got to tell you, I'm not nervous at all about this weekend, because last year, Rob and I had the worst thing that could happen to you on a Limitless weekend. We had DQs hit Lewis Hamilton, Charles Leclerc, and the Mercedes constructor. So really not a whole lot can get worse than that. But Rob, if it does, you're never allowed to be on site at a sprint weekend again.
No, I know. I tweeted that terrible coincidence into existence during the week. I won't say it on stream for the sake of potentially jinxing the Limitless again. But for anyone who's kind of following along, this is my second sprint race weekend, and coincidentally also the same time I've activated Limitless. So hopefully there's not a similar trend this time around. But I think, to your point, Adam, going back to the chip itself, it is, as you've mentioned, something we'd kind of planned for from the very early stages of the season. And I think for me, it is at a point where I'm very content with the decision. I haven't activated the chip myself, but I plan to do so after the stream. And I'm, regardless of the outcome, I think the decision was made based on the best available information last week. Given I think we were less inclined to go with China at a track we've not raced at in 5 years and save it for a weekend like Miami, where, as you pointed out, good records for Ferrari, for Red Bull, and a McLaren car that seems to be on the up. So I'm very, at peace with the decision, and what will be. If it's a good weekend, fantastic. If it's a less than desirable outcome, then there's really not much we can do about it. But I think based on the information we know at this point in time, a great weekend to use the Limitless chip.
And don't fret too. I mean, after that huge disaster at Coda last year, I still finished in the top 3,000 in the world. It's a long season. There's a lot of ways we can nibble away at these points. So just go with whatever is statistically most likely to work, and either it does or it doesn't, and then we can make that up in the rest of the season.
Definitely. Do you want to quickly knock out a couple more chat questions? Then we can jump into Terry's technical corner.
Let's do it. Nicholas is coming to us from Denmark. Hello, Nicholas. Bobby J is coming to us from Australia. Hi, Bobby. If you had to choose between Bottas or Sargent as budget drivers, who would you choose for Miami?
Terry, I want to defer to you here.
Yeah, I'm deferring to Terry. Terry, what do you think?
I would probably flip a coin.
So
I'll probably go Bottas on the basis of finishing the race. If I had to choose between the two, would be my inkling. I actually think the Williams' performance is stronger than Sauber here, but in terms of the two drivers, I'd probably fancy Bottas more likely to finish the race safely and not lose you as many points as what potentially having Logan would if you got a choice between the two. That's the reason behind it. Not the pace of the Sauber, but the quality of Valtteri.
That's exactly what I was going to say. And I think there's been this undercurrent of our last few shows with Rob and I where Sargent's finished the last 9 races, but we think it's only a matter of time before his first DNF of the year. And with all this news swirling about Williams petitioning the FIA for a dispensation for Kimi Antonelli's super license, there's a lot in his mind right now. And I think it's only a matter of time before we see him DNF.
Definitely.
All right. Michael asked in the chat, swap Albon for Zhou or Hulk?
Probably Hulk, just for me anyway.
Hulk.
I'll jump in. Is just because I think that consistency and reliability of the Haas, their race pace, they've had some of the highest overtakes this season, and also been some of the highest budget gainers among all fantasy assets. So for me, I think that's an easy decision. Joe looks great, but I'm just not sure the class and the racecraft and fantasy value is there.
Agreed. I think Hulk can do a lot of work in the midfield, just overtakes as they go back and forth among each other. So I would say Hulk also a great bet for cost cap increases too. All right, let's put a pin in it there and head over to you, Terry, for the tech corner this week. What are some of the biggest storylines that you're following that we should be aware of as we set our lineups this week?
I think the biggest one has to be that surprise of McLaren, hasn't it? I mean, no one expected that one before Imola. We were expecting this update at Imola. It's quite clearly been brought forward, certainly for Lando, and obviously half for Oscar. This is to change that part Ferme rule, to be honest. If we didn't have to change the part Ferme, I've got absolutely no doubt that would have sat on the shelf until we got to Imola. But obviously, that ability to change setups is kind of buoying with the confidence to at least give it a go on Lando's car and see what it brings to it. So, I mean, they've been the biggest ones. I think for me, Aston Martin are really quiet this weekend. All of their updates were very circuit specific, so no actual updates as such, more around the rear wing and the front wing. So they seem to be just kind of like treading water and hovering, not really standing out anywhere. And I'm not quite sure where their real pace is. I think it's better than what the Mercedes and the V car is, but I don't think it's up with the McLaren and the Ferrari. So I can see Fernando just kind of skirting around in that middle of the sort of top six as he does. So it's going to be an interesting weekend for Aston Martin, that's for sure.
It's such a surprise because these guys were P17, P19 at this race last year. It was before the first big wave of McLaren updates. And now here we are 1 year later and they're contending for a podium once again. Very, very powerful upgrade packages from McLaren earlier in the year. It's even surprised me how much the gains that they've made in just one race.
Yeah, they're doing on this basis of developing last year's car. If you look at when they launched the car in Bahrain, it was actually very much an evolution of last year's car. They were late to the party in terms of development last year. They've carried that forward with this philosophy they've got of just developing the current car rather than trying to bring something new to the table like some of the other teams have done. So I think that's definitely helping. They've clearly got a really good handle on what works for that McLaren over teams like Mercedes who's still trying to work out where to get that performance. It seems like McLaren have got that baseline now and they're building on that, whereas I think some of the other teams are still struggling to find actually what unlocks that baseline. So definitely really, really impressive development from them. To carry that on from last year, they've looked strong. Like I say, medium times, they look really strong. I fully expect them to be battling with Ferrari in the actual race pace itself. I think Red Bull is going to be the team to beat. Checo, for me, has looked really comfortable this weekend. Consolidating actually his performances this season. Checo's been really consistent actually this year. And, listen to Christian Horner yesterday. He's really happy and impressed with how Checo's currently performing. So I think that Checo and Red Bull, with Max obviously being out ahead, is going to be the team to beat. But in terms of the rest, I think McLaren and Ferrari are going to be so close when we get to the actual race itself. And then I think, you're then going to get the Aston, V-car Mercedes sort of gap behind it. So, it's going to be interesting.
Terry, go ahead, Rob.
I was just going to say quickly, I think to your point, Terry, given how close it is at the top between McLaren and Ferrari, I couldn't fault anyone going for a little bit of McLaren coverage, whether you're on Limitless or non-Limitless, because I just think, as you say, that Terry, the upside is there for them to really contend for a podium or two if they can get their act together for Grand Prix qualifying. And I think Limitless is, as you say, as you've talked about already, Adam, as well, we've had our kind of minds firmly locked on triple Ferrari, triple Red Bull, and maybe one McLaren, but I think there were a couple of questions before around McLaren constructor potentially. And if Lando can string together another P2, we know how good they are with their pit stops. The McLaren constructor could really deliver, the second highest scoring points, Red Bull aside. And I think you also mentioned before that, the difference between McLaren and Ferrari is probably not that big of a gulf, but I think they are a high upside and a very big differential pick that, if it comes off, could really result in a pretty big boon of points. So anyone who's weighing that up and wants to, but doesn't have maybe the guts or so to go with it, I wouldn't disagree with any kind of sentiment there.
And that covers off a question from Elise Lemieux in the chat about having McLaren as the constructor on a Limitless build with both Ferrari drivers. Our friends at F1 Fantasy Tools predict that they'll be the second highest scoring constructor this week. So there's a lot of sound logic into running them. For me personally, I'm leaning toward Ferrari, and the difference between the two of them, even in the predictions, are fairly small. So I don't think the wrong answer will be wrong by very much.
No, definitely.
Terry, we have a friend in the chat. Allison from IGAF1 says hello. Hi,
Hello,
Allison.
Allison.
And for anyone who hasn't seen the IGAF1 podcast, they have a wonderful show. Terry and I have both been on it this year, and we had a really great time with them. They have updates every week that break down everything that's happening on and off the track. So I highly recommend you check them out.
Absolutely.
Terry, my next question for you is about the impact of support series and the evolution of the track, because we had the Porsche Carrera free practice session last night, and then F1 Academy is having a session this morning before we get back on the track for the sprint. How do you think that will evolve the track and potentially impact the running order of the sprint?
It's massive support races. We know that Miami tends to be resurfaced every time we get back there. We've obviously been a temporary track, so it does evolve very quickly with the rubbering in from the support races. So I think that's certainly going to play into the F1 cars when they finally get on track. In terms of how it's going to affect it, I think what we saw yesterday, like I alluded to earlier with the soft tyres, I think those medium tyres are going to be the key tyre. And looking at that, I think McLaren have certainly honed in on that performance, and the soft tyre, just like I said earlier, just isn't worth going on to unless you're wanting a quick lap somewhere or a late safety car maybe. I mean, we got a 50-50 in terms of safety car around Miami, so 50% chance of a normal safety car, 50% chance of a virtual safety car. So it, again, even that is smack bang down the middle in terms of what could happen going around the track. It's not a track that tends to bring out the safety car too much unless obviously you park it like Charles did in FP1. But apart from that, it's going to be really close in terms of the team's strategy. Strategy isn't going to be a big difference this weekend. I don't see anyone pulling the major strategy change off. It should be a one stop unless the safety car forces you to do. But if it does, I think all the teams would just follow suit anyway and box each other off and cover each other off with a late safety car or even an early safety car. So I think it's all down to the pace.
There was no DNFs in 2023, if I'm not mistaken. And Adam, I know you've kind of written about this a little bit already. I'd be very surprised if we go 2 years without a single on-track incident. But I do think I take some confidence knowing the conditions are dry. I think the drivers have 2 years of racing under their belts there. And I don't think it's by any means one of the more difficult tracks on the calendar. There's obviously a couple of tricky bits through sectors 2 and even sector 1's quite high speed. You're on the throttle quite a fair bit through that too. So I know we saw a couple of guys hit the wall. Is it turn 15 or turn 16 coming onto the back straight? But I'm not really overly concerned that we could have a high attrition rate this weekend.
Yeah, it's got some quite nice big runoffs, really, when you think about it. Certainly that sector 1, you've got a lot of areas if you make a mistake to kind of back out and save the car from doing any sort of permanent damage, or even park it somewhere to bring out WLOs rather than safety car. So I think that's why we don't see the safety car too much around Miami, to be honest.
And the only other technical question I had for you, Terry, was around the temperature. I think this will be one of the warmer races we have this year. Generally, Red Bull tend to work better in warmer conditions, Mercedes better in cooler conditions. Could that explain in part why Mercedes has fallen out of the top 10 in the early stages?
Yeah, it could be. I mean, 27, 28 degrees is, I think, the expected forecast for today and tomorrow. So quite warm temperatures. Teams seem to be struggling a bit with Mercedes seem to be struggling. If you look at their car, they've actually added some vents on top of the side pods, which is kind of gone a bit unnoticed by quite a lot of the commentators at the moment, which suggests they're not happy with the cooling on that Mercedes engine by adding quite a lot more. McLaren, obviously, they run the Mercedes engine. They've actually changed the cooling and the engine cover as part of their update. So again, fingers crossed they've got that right, but they've actually made some big changes to that part of the car and that part of the cooling as well. So it might be a concern at some point with what's happening with Mercedes, but we're not seeing anything that leads us to think there's a big problem with engine cooling at the moment. It seems the teams are on top of it with the designs they've got and the adaptations where they add the loos in and take them out. They seem to be pretty on top of that now. I think the early signs we had from Mercedes was more they closed too many of those up for the race. I think they learned a lesson from that and have kept them fully open. So they were trying to gain a bit of extra time by closing up early on. I think it's Bahrain where they had the problem, or Saudi. But by closing it up, they caused the problem. They haven't made that mistake again since. So I think that side of it is pretty fine.
Interesting. I definitely want to see how this unfolds over the course of the weekend. Definitely keeping my fingers and toes crossed that something will work for Mercedes eventually. I remember at this race last year, Mercedes looked really tough in the early sessions. It was a regular weekend, so it was the free practices. They were at the back of the grid. They were able to salvage points and have a huge comeback, maybe through some setup changes in Parc Ferme. So hopefully they can unlock something to get up the grid a little bit. But I definitely wouldn't recommend them for fantasy purposes this week until they've proven their worth.
No, and it doesn't sound like they've got a lot in the bag. When you listen to the drivers, you listen to George, you listen to Lewis, they're talking about they're not experimenting. That is the setup of the car. I've heard this morning there's some rumblings with Lewis and mechanics in terms of setups and how he's not happy with the direction the team's going. So I think that's a telltale sign as well that they're clearly struggling to find the optimum pace with the updates they brought. They brought that revise to the floor edge. They brought some slight tweaks to the front suspension, where I'm not quite sure if they're using that different arm we saw in pre-season. They only talked on the update that they've adjusted the front suspension where the arm is, which makes me think they might have moved it for this weekend. And again, I'm struggling with that. I don't know if they can move it back. They certainly haven't done that yet on a race weekend. So it'd be interesting to see what they get from the sprint. And then if they make any changes, knowing where they're going to be, where they start the sprint, I think they're going to be more set at gathering and getting ready for qualifying with where their position is. So they might be using it very much as a testing session to see what's going to work going into it. But again, we see this thing with Mercedes on sprint weekends. They very clearly struggle with not having the free practice sessions to tweak setups and move setups and run different options, put Mick in the simulator, all those things Mercedes like to do. They're not prone to very good sprint performances, to be honest. They either get the sprint right and the race wrong, or vice versa, the other way around. It's very rare you get a good sprint and a good race from Mercedes.
You make a good point about Mick. This was around the time last year that Mick was really proving his worth in the simulator in between sessions. All right, we have a few lineups left to cover. I want to make sure we get through them. Let's get these back up on screen, and then we can start digging into it. While our producer works on that, Rob, let me ask you an interesting 2x DRS boost question that came in the chat. Yep. Lando or Checo?
Ooh,
so that is I imagine this is considering Checo will finish higher in the race, but Norris not only has the sprint positions gained, but the higher likelihood of driver of the day.
That is a great question. I'm probably torn. I think if I had to give an unbiased answer, and budget is of absolutely no concern to the person asking the question, I'm leaning towards Lando Norris. And I know, Terry, you've just mentioned that Perez over a full race weekend should be slightly better, but I think the fact that not only is Lando projected to score 6 more points in F1 Fantasy Tours points projections, and assuming this is also a non-limitless team, because I think the budget gain and the potential price increase factors into my answer here, is that Lando's also expected to go up in budget slightly more than Checo. So I think as a high differential pick, that could really pay off if Lando does well. So I'm not sure if either of you would agree with that, and I'm happy to be the odd man out here, but I really like Lando for this weekend, and I'm going to say with a full set of upgrades, he's my pick over Perez.
No, I'm with you, and for all the reasons you said, we saw that both last week at China and then all of last year that Lando's a very popular pick for driver of the day. I think if he lands on the podium and has a decent sprint, that we'll see him get driver of the day again. And that's a big differentiator. If Perez is P2 and Lando's P3 or P4, those positions gained in the sprint and driver of the day is going to move him up a bit. And then, like you said, also the ability to gain some cost cap is going to be huge for him. So I would take Lando in that situation. All right, let's move over to Beep's lineup. So Beep has max builds, and then a combination of Sauber and Williams, and it's a matter of how much Haas do you want. I really like Team 3, but not for 9s20.
I think I'm not sure if it's for me. I'm not sure if I could justify a -20. It's Bottas versus Sargent for the teams on the left. So probably Bottas because of what the three of us were talking about before. Bottas for Sargent. I'm not sure if a -20 with K-Mag in there is worth the extra trade for me.
Agreed. I think you've actually ranked them in order here. Beep 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
All right, BZ. This is a limitless build with triple Red Bull, double McLaren, double Ferrari. Got a lot of questions coming in recently in the chat about who to have in this limitless lineup. And so our friends at F1 Fantasy Tools say this is the best lineup, that McLaren will outscore Ferrari. The margins are small, 11-ish points. And so I think you're just a fastest pit stop, a couple of overtakes away from Ferrari flipping that result upside down. But this is a perfectly fine lineup. I think you'd be good with this or this same lineup with Ferrari as the first constructor.
Yeah, I really like it. I'm actually quite surprised there's a 2x on both Verstappen and Charles. So just make sure you've got the
look at that glitch.
Yeah, that's a glitch. So either make sure you've got the DRS boost on the right driver, or if for whatever reason it glitches out and gives you double points for both, then a huge result for BZ.
BZ, if you get double 2x boost, we need to see a picture of that. We must. Here's Mike's lineup. Been waiting a long time for the Mike lineup, and it's here. Tsunoda or Hülkenberg in that last spot.
Hülkenberg.
Yeah,
I think it's close. And yeah, Mike, a friend of the show, so thank you again, not just to Mike, but to everyone who submitted lineups. But yeah, it's a tough one. I think I'm inclined to agree with you, Terry. I think Hulk's got that consistency, that kind of budget game, the race pace. Although I think it'll be quite close between RB and Haas this weekend. So I couldn't fault either pick, but I'm probably going to say Hulk in this case.
I'll just say Yuki seems to be struggling a bit more this weekend than what Hülkenberg looks, and I don't think the tired egg that Haas suffered with in China, I don't think is going to be as big in Miami, to be honest. So I think that what we saw with Haas and to a degree Ferrari in terms of China, we know that front left took a right pounding with China. It's not as bad with Miami, even though we got the C2, C3, C4 compound. So I'm fully expecting tired egg to not be as much of an issue as what it was last time out, which will put Haas back into play a lot more than what we maybe saw in China.
One question I'll just quickly pose to the both of you is, we had a question about 7 minutes ago from NK in the chat. For those of us that can afford a lineup like what Mike has on screen, what is your hierarchy in terms of filling the remaining slots? So there's obviously 4 positions we need to fill of what is typically midfield or back market teams. In terms of driver ranking or team ranking, Bottas, Zhou, Sargent, Hülkenberg, Tsunoda, etc. kind of, what's your tiered approach to filling up those, assuming budget is no option under 9 million?
Oh,
I mean, mine's more around who you think is going to finish the race in terms of, keeping out of trouble and not losing your points through a crash, that sort of thing. So when I look at it, I would look at that side of it rather than the individual performances, because I think when they're that low, you're being carried by that sort of max points, which Adam alluded to earlier. So it's kind of just making sure it's mitigating the loss as such, isn't it? So I think that's what you got to look at is, like I said earlier, someone like Valtteri, I would have over Logan based purely on, I've got more confidence in Valtteri, maybe gaining a few places, but also keeping his nose out of trouble and finishing the race than what I would have with Logan Sargent. So yeah, that's probably my thinking behind it, because they're so close in that bottom half there. The overtakes kind of mitigate each other with the pit stops, and you find that DRS train as well locks them all in. There's not one team in that bottom half which has got that unlocked performance that you would expect to come back through the pack with a good performance. Williams and the Sauber are not going to have the engine capability or the performance to suddenly, if you had like an Aston Martin or McLaren back there because of a fault or a new engine penalty, you'd expect them to come flying through. But I don't think those other teams have got the capability with how close it is with that midfield and how that DRS train locks in to do that. Okay. So I can't see too much movement apart from around pit stop. So it's definitely around keeping your nose out of trouble for me.
I think that's why I'm leaning towards Haas drivers was probably my pick of the bunch. Then maybe Tsunoda, then maybe Bottas and Albon, and then Zhou, Sargent for me, if I had to kind of give a ranking off the top of my head. You could probably move either driver up or down one spot, but I think that's kind of the general order.
Yeah.
And I agree. No changes there. All right, and let's go to the last team here. Bobby is racing this team or Limitless. So this is almost exactly what I could run if I was to run a normal budget team this week. And I'm leaning toward Limitless just for some of the reasons we talked about earlier. Fairly safe track, fairly predictable running order, no DNFs here last year. Biggest gap between a Limitless team and a normal budget team for the sake of a points delta. So that's why I'm running Limitless. This is a perfectly fine team if you want to run a normal budget team and save Limitless for later in the season. We've still got 4 sprints left, but I would just caution, there are 3 chips that I think are most powerful on a sprint weekend. There's Limitless, the 3x DRS boost, and no negative. And there's only 4 sprint races left. So if you show up to a weekend and something weird happens, now you're forced into using 3 chips in 3 races. So that's what's holding me into doing it now.
Great point, Adam.
Yeah, no, I think about Adam on the pecking order is probably really crucial now with Limitless. We don't know what teams are bringing for Imola onwards. Every single team has got an upgrade package for Imola, and it only takes a McLaren style jump, an Aston Martin style jump for that pecking order to be completely turned on its head. We don't know what they've got in their bags. There's a lot of teams who have made very little updates to their cars or very slight tweaks, which makes you think they're planning something a lot bigger for when the European legs kick in. Yeah, certain teams, Aston Martin haven't brought a lot, Mercedes haven't brought a lot so far. So they're clearly holding back for Imola in Europe before they introduce them. So that could completely change the pecking order around in terms of who's where.
Sounds good. And just covering off a few other things from the chat, Sean had asked about the steering concerns from Norris and Piastri. And Terry, let me ask you about this, because I heard on the broadcast, you can't really fix it during the session, but it's a fairly easy thing to fix. Do you see this afflicting them all weekend?
No, I think Zach Brown, I saw an interview with him afterwards where he said that they pretty much got it under control. It wasn't to do with the updates at all. It was a fix they needed to make. And they put a temporary sort of fix on to get him through the qualifying, but they've got no concerns it's going to affect it at all. It's not a part. It's a part they can easily swap out if they needed to under part for him anyway. So if they got any doubts, it's a like for like swap. So they wouldn't incur any penalties for it if they had to replace it. So if they need to, they would have already done so. And if not, I think they're pretty confident with it. So I don't see it being a big concern at all.
Rob, I want to get an opinion from you because there is a debate apparently going across all of the F1 fantasy pundits about which non-limitless team is best for this week. Verstappen, Red Bull, Ferrari, or Norris, Stroll, Red Bull, Ferrari. I think while you think about that, I've had a minute to marinate on it. As much as I like Norris this week, and as much as Stroll could give you budget increase potential, I want Max over everything. I want the highest end, safest asset first. And if the sum of parts are greater than the whole later, that good for you if it works for you. But for me, I want the safer thing.
Yeah, no, I'm completely aligned. I think it's going to be close, to be honest, scoring wise, assuming no issues from any of the drivers in question. I think the thing you're just getting from Max is his reliability and consistency, the ability to not just kind of churn out P1s in the sprint qualifying in the Grand Prix, but he was on for a fastest lap in the sprint race last week. He's always good for a fastest lap. I think he had close to 50% of fastest laps in Grand Prix last year. I think it was maybe 10 of 23. So he's got a very good record there as well. At a circuit, he has won out the last 2 years and has won driver of the day in 2022 and 2023 as well. I don't think he'll score driver of the day in Miami unless we see something very unexpected in race quali. But I think I'm just really liking the consistency and the history at this circuit. So Norris, I think, has a lot of upside. Stroll's the one variable in the equation, and I'm not sure if it's enough for me to be swayed in that direction.
Agreed. A couple of quick thoughts, by the way, about this Almave. One, it's delicious. And 2, for a non-distilled spirit, it leaves a little burn in the back of your throat, like actual alcohol, which I wasn't expecting. And it really opens up when you put it on ice. It tastes better cold than warm. So
if you
kudos to Lewis, you can do it all.
Maybe Terry, you can with your coffee mix up an espresso martini one week, and I can bring some of the Sergio Perez tequila I have at my place, courtesy of my girlfriend. So I think there's a few different concoctions we can mix up one day.
I think Rob's only allowed to drink
Absolutely.
out of a shoe on this show from now on. So if it's
Yes.
milk, beer, hard alcohol, whatever, it's got to be out of a shoe. All right. Just
Apparently
to cover off. Sorry, go ahead, Terry.
Apparently they've got espresso martinis at Silverstone tomorrow, so I'll have to try one out for the race and get back to you on that one, Rob.
Definitely.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Now, I've alluded to this a lot throughout the show, but here is my Limitless team, and it's triple Red Bull, triple Ferrari, and Lando. And as we talked about earlier in the show, you could run McLaren as your second constructor, and that would be totally fine. F1 Fantasy Tools agrees. I think there's a perfectly good chance McLaren look great in this race. I would caution against bringing Piastri into this lineup over Sainz based only off of the sprint qualifying results. I think Sainz is the more consistent driver over the course of the year. And then Terry had some great analysis earlier in the show talking about the lack of data on Piastri's race pace. Can he maintain the tires throughout the course of the Grand Prix? And we do know that Carlos can do that pretty consistently. So I think Lando's the only McLaren that will crack my lineup.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, let's draw a winner for our contest this week. I got to get the example names out of here, put our friends in, and away we go. It's a close one. It's Tig. Congratulations, Tig. Will be in touch with you on how you can get your Fifth Gear Garms gift card. I'm really excited for Fifth Gear Garms these next couple of weeks. They just unleashed a new wave of hats. So now we can have all of the 2024 liveries on hats. And then they've told us behind the scenes there are some other really interesting things going on. And then on Friday, we saw on their socials, they posted the initial design of a Ferrari featuring some blue for this weekend. So I think we'll be seeing that in the near future too.
Cool. Congrats, Tig. All right. Well, I am keen to quickly knock out the last few dregs of the questions in the chat with you guys, and then maybe we can call it a day.
Sure. Dusan in the chat asked about the deadline for final fix on a sprint weekend. There are two. If you set your lineup now, watch the sprint race, and then use final fix before qualifying, you'll have a first deadline clock to qualifying. And then if you apply the final fix after qualifying, your countdown clock will be to the Grand Prix. This is important because if you see the sprint and say, I'm going to use final fix at some point, you only have until qualifying to use it and get a guy out. So just be mindful. There are two deadlines based on when you apply final fix.
I think some love for you, Adam, and your offline coaching for Laura's success
No,
this year.
I'll tell you. So things are going really well with Laura in the league. She's been talking so much smack on the weekend warm-up. I'm so glad to see her in first place. I talked to her yesterday, and it looks like she plans to run the same Limitless build as me. So our little bet will move into Imola, where I personally guarantee we will have different lineups and we will have a winner for Imola. I've also been in touch with Chris McCarthy recently. I think he'll be using a chip this weekend too. So our friends are two of the top three this weekend. And I think Chris will quickly overtake P2 because they've used all of their big chips already.
Cool.
Awesome. Guys, anything else? Anything we haven't covered before we break for today?
No, another great show. Sorry for the technical difficulties at the start, but we got through, and I'm very excited to be on track for the weekend. It's going to be a really fun race. I think we'll see a lot of interesting kind of races and battles on track.
Absolutely. Well, good luck to all of you and your fantasy teams this weekend. Thank you all very much for joining, and we'll be back leading up to the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix in 2 weeks. See you soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.